The dress cost me 4 months of savings, and I was standing at the altar in it when my fiancé turned to face the woman he'd left behind 3 years ago, walked past me, past our 200 guests, past the life we'd built together, and simply said her name like a prayer he'd been holding in his chest the whole time we were engaged. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet miracle of second chances, take a moment right now to like this video, drop a comment below, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community grows stronger every time someone new decides that broken hearts deserve better endings. Now let me take you back to the morning it all fell apart, and the years that followed, because this story isn't really about the day I lost him. It's about everything I found after. My name is Margaret Ashcombe, though everyone who loves me calls me Meg, and on the morning of my wedding I woke up in my childhood bedroom in a small town outside Bristol with sunlight pouring through lace curtains my grandmother had sewn decades earlier. I remember lying there for a long moment just breathing, feeling the kind of happiness that seems too large for a single body to hold. I was 29 years old, and I had spent the last 2 years planning every detail of that day with a devotion that bordered on obsession, because I believed, truly believed, that if I got every single thing right, nothing could go wrong. The flowers were peonies, my mother's favorite, arranged in soft blush and cream. The venue was an old converted barn on a hillside overlooking a valley that turned gold every summer. My dress had a sweetheart neckline and a trailing lace hem that I had altered 3 times until it fit like it had been poured onto me. I thought I had accounted for everything. I had not accounted for Vivian Hartley. I should explain who Thomas Whitfield was to me, because he was, for 6 years, the center of my entire universe. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party when I was 23, newly graduated and terrified of the world, and he was 25, already confident in that easy way some men have where they seem to belong wherever they stand. He had a laugh that filled a room and a habit of remembering small details about people, the name of your childhood dog, the way you took your coffee, the book you mentioned once in passing that he would later buy you as a gift. I fell for him slowly and then all at once, the way people say happens but that I never quite believed until it happened to me. We moved in together after a year. We adopted a scruffy terrier named Baxter who slept between us every night. We built a life that looked, from every angle I could see, like the beginning of a very long and very good story. What I did not know, what Thomas had never told me in any real detail, was that before me there had been Vivian, a woman he had loved with the kind of intensity that some people only experience once in a lifetime, and that their relationship had ended not because the love ran out but because of circumstances neither of them could control. She had moved abroad for a career opportunity when they were both 22, and in the way of young love facing distance, they had drifted, argued, and eventually stopped answering each other's calls. Thomas told me once, early in our relationship, that he had loved someone before me and that it hadn't worked out, and I, foolishly perhaps, never asked for more than that. I didn't want to know the shape of the wound. I wanted to believe I was enough to fill whatever space had been left behind. For 6 years, I was enough. Or so I thought. We got engaged on a beach in Cornwall during a weekend trip that he had planned down to the last detail, and I remember crying so hard I could barely say yes, and he laughed and wiped my tears with his thumb and told me I was the answer to a question he hadn't even known he was asking. I believed him. I believed every word of it, the way you believe the sky is blue, without needing proof, because some things simply feel true. The morning of the wedding, my mother helped me into my dress while my younger sister, Charlotte, fussed with my hair, and my best friend since university, a sharp-tongued and warm-hearted woman named Delphine Rourke, kept everyone laughing to keep my nerves at bay. I remember Delphine holding my hands in the mirror and telling me that Thomas didn't deserve me, not because he was a bad man, but because no one could deserve a heart as generous as mine, and that he was simply lucky. I laughed and told her to stop before she made my mascara run. I had no idea how much I would need to remember those words later. The barn was full by the time I arrived, sunlight slanting through the high windows, the smell of peonies and fresh hay and candle wax mixing into something that felt like the beginning of a fairy tale. My father walked me down the aisle, and I remember every face turned toward me, and I remember Thomas standing at the altar in his charcoal suit, and I remember thinking he looked pale, paler than a groom should look on the happiest day of his life, but I told myself it was nerves. I told myself a lot of things that morning that turned out not to be true. The ceremony began. The officiant spoke about love and commitment and the long road two people choose to walk together. I said my vows first, my voice trembling with joy, promising to stand beside Thomas through every season of our lives. And then it was his turn, and he opened his mouth, and nothing came out. He looked past me, toward the back of the barn, and his face changed in a way I had never seen before, not fear exactly, not joy exactly, but something raw and unguarded that made my stomach drop before I even understood why. I turned to follow his gaze, and there, standing just inside the doorway, uninvited, unannounced, wearing a plain green coat and an expression of someone who had run out of ways to stay away, was Vivian Hartley. I did not know her face then. I only learned it later, piece by piece, the way you learn the shape of a wound by pressing on it. But I knew, in that moment, standing in my wedding dress with 200 people watching, that something had shifted permanently in the air between Thomas and me. He looked at her, and then he looked at me, and then, in the longest and most silent 10 seconds of my entire life, he made his choice. He walked away from the altar. He walked past my mother, who gasped audibly. He walked past my father, whose hand instinctively reached for mine and found only air. He walked down the aisle, past the peonies, past the guests frozen in their seats, and he stopped in front of Vivian and said her name the way you'd say the name of someone you'd been drowning without. I have relived that moment more times than I can count, and I still cannot fully describe what it felt like to stand there, in that dress, in front of everyone who loved me, and watch the man I was about to marry choose someone else in real time. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was humiliation layered over grief, layered over a strange, disorienting sense that the last 6 years of my life might have been, in some fundamental way, a story I had told myself rather than one that was actually true. I remember Charlotte rushing toward me, and Delphine already on her feet, her face contorted with fury, and my mother crying into my father's shoulder, and somewhere in the chaos, Thomas turned back to look at me one final time. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply said, in a voice that cracked with something that might have been shame, that he was sorry, that he had thought he could move on, that he had tried, truly tried, but that seeing her again had made him realize he never actually had. I want to tell you that I screamed, or that I collapsed, or that I did something dramatic that people talk about for years. I didn't. I stood very still, and I looked at him, and something inside me that had been holding on with white knuckles simply let go. I reached down, unclasped the ring from my finger, the ring I had worn for 18 months, the ring that had felt like a promise every single day, and I placed it gently on the nearest table, beside a vase of peonies, as if I were setting down something heavy I had been carrying too long. Then I turned to the room full of people who had come to watch me get married, and I said, in a voice steadier than I felt, that the wedding was over, but that I hoped they would still stay for the food, because Lord knew we had paid for it and no one deserved to go hungry over my humiliation. A few people laughed, nervously, and I think that small laugh, that tiny moment of dark humor in the middle of catastrophe, is what kept me from completely falling apart. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, take a moment now to think about someone in your own life who showed you unexpected strength in a moment of heartbreak. If this story is resonating with you, please like it, and leave a comment about a time you had to find courage you didn't know you had. It helps our community grow, and it means more to me than you know. The weeks that followed were, without exaggeration, the hardest of my life. I moved out of the flat Thomas and I had shared, taking Baxter with me because Thomas, to his credit or perhaps his cowardice, didn't fight me on it. I moved into my sister Charlotte's spare room, surrounded by boxes I didn't have the energy to unpack, and I spent the first 2 weeks doing very little besides crying and sleeping and occasionally forcing myself to eat toast because Charlotte stood over me until I did. My mother called every day. My father, a quiet man who rarely spoke about feelings, sent me a card that simply said, "You are still whole, even when it doesn't feel that way," and I kept it on my nightstand for months, reading it on the nights when I forgot that fact entirely. Delphine, my fierce and loyal friend, appointed herself my unofficial guardian during that time. She showed up unannounced with takeaway and terrible reality television, and she let me talk in circles about the wedding, about Thomas, about Vivian, whose name I said with a bitterness I wasn't proud of but couldn't help. Delphine never once told me to move on before I was ready. She simply sat with me in the wreckage, which I have come to believe is one of the truest forms of love there is. It took me nearly a month to work up the courage to ask my mother what had happened after I left the barn, because I had walked out shortly after setting down the ring, unable to stay in that room a second longer. My mother told me, gently, that Thomas had tried to explain himself to the remaining guests, that Vivian had stood awkwardly near the door the entire time, clearly uncomfortable with the scene she had caused, and that eventually the two of them had left together, Thomas still in his wedding suit, walking out into the golden afternoon light as if he were walking toward some second chance he believed he deserved. My mother told me she had wanted to slap him. My father, uncharacteristically, had wanted to do worse. But they had both restrained themselves for my sake, because their priority, they said, was making sure I was safe and cared for, not seeking revenge on a man who clearly wasn't worth the energy. I learned more of the story later, in bits and pieces, some from mutual friends who felt obligated to tell me, some from Thomas himself in a single, stilted phone call I allowed him weeks after the wedding. Vivian, it turned out, had returned to England only 3 days before my wedding, after her marriage abroad had ended in a divorce that left her, by all accounts, shattered. She had reached out to Thomas not with any intention of stopping the wedding, but simply because she was back in the country and wanted to see an old friend, someone who had once known her better than anyone. Thomas had agreed to meet her for coffee, just once, just to catch up, he told me, his voice thin with something like guilt. And in that single meeting, something that had never fully died in him had roared back to life. He told me he had spent the days leading up to our wedding in a state of panic he couldn't explain even to himself, that he had told himself repeatedly that it was nothing, that he loved me, that Vivian was simply a ghost from his past he needed to lay to rest. But on the morning of the wedding, he had received a text from her, a simple message wishing him happiness, and something in him had broken open. He couldn't say why he had invited her, except that some reckless, desperate part of him had wanted her to see him standing at the altar, as if her witnessing his commitment to someone else might finally free him from her. Instead, the opposite had happened. Seeing her walk through that door had confirmed something he had spent years trying to deny. I listened to all of this with a strange, hollow calm. I did not scream at him. I did not ask him to justify himself further. I simply told him that I hoped he found whatever peace he was looking for, because I certainly wasn't going to spend one more minute of my life helping him look for it. Then I hung up the phone, and I cried harder than I had at any point since the wedding itself, not because I still wanted him back, but because I finally, fully understood that the version of Thomas I had loved for 6 years had never been entirely mine to begin with. Some part of him had always belonged to a door that never quite closed. The months that followed were about rebuilding, slowly and imperfectly. I threw myself into my work as an interior designer, taking on projects I might have previously turned down for lack of time, filling my days so completely that I had less room to think about the wedding that wasn't. I started running in the mornings, not because I loved exercise but because the rhythm of my feet against pavement gave my mind something to focus on besides grief. I reconnected with old friends I had let drift during my relationship with Thomas, discovering, to my surprise, how much I had missed simple things like long conversations that didn't revolve around wedding planning or someone else's needs. Charlotte, who had let me stay with her far longer than either of us initially planned, became not just my sister but genuinely one of my closest friends, the two of us staying up late some nights talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding a closeness that our busy adult lives had let slip. It was nearly 8 months after the wedding when I met Julian Farrow, though meeting him wasn't nearly as dramatic as the way I had met Thomas. There was no dinner party, no immediate spark of destiny. I met Julian because my sister's ancient boiler broke in the dead of winter, and the plumber Charlotte called happened to be running late, so Julian, her neighbor and, as it turned out, a structural engineer by trade who simply knew his way around old houses, came over to help in the meantime. I remember opening the door in an oversized jumper and thick socks, my hair a mess, completely unprepared to make any kind of impression, and finding a tall man with kind eyes and a slightly crooked smile standing on the doorstep, holding a toolbox he had brought purely out of neighborly instinct. He introduced himself, apologized for showing up unannounced, and spent the next hour fixing what he could of the boiler while Charlotte and I made him tea out of gratitude. He was quiet in a way that felt calm rather than distant, the kind of quiet that made you want to fill it with conversation because you sensed he was actually listening. I did not fall for Julian immediately. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's important, especially for anyone watching this who has been hurt and worries they'll never trust again. I was cautious with him in a way I had never been cautious with Thomas. I found myself watching for warning signs, bracing for disappointment, keeping careful distance even as we started seeing more of each other, first as casual acquaintances who ran into each other at Charlotte's, then as friends who occasionally grabbed coffee, then, slowly, as something more. Julian never pushed. He never asked me to explain the wedding, though he clearly knew about it through the small-town grapevine that connects everyone eventually. He simply showed up, consistently, quietly, in small ways that accumulated over time into something I couldn't ignore. He remembered that I took my tea with too much milk. He noticed when I was stressed before I said anything about it. He asked about my work with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. And crucially, he never once made me feel like I needed to hurry toward trusting him. He let me arrive at my own pace, which, after everything I had been through, felt like its own kind of love. If you've ever had to rebuild trust after someone shattered it, I want you to know I see you, and I'm proud of you for still trying. If this part of the story feels familiar, take a moment to comment below and share what helped you learn to trust again. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. It was nearly a year and a half after my wedding that wasn't when Julian first told me he loved me, and I remember the moment with a clarity that still makes my chest tighten pleasantly when I think about it. We were sitting on a bench overlooking the same valley where Thomas and I had planned to hold our reception, though we hadn't chosen the spot deliberately. It had simply become one of our favorite places to walk. Baxter, who had taken to Julian with an enthusiasm that felt like a small, furry vote of confidence. The afternoon light was doing that particular golden thing it does in early autumn, and Julian, who rarely spoke in grand gestures, simply turned to me and said that he didn't need me to be fixed or finished healing to know that he loved me, that he had loved me for a while now, quietly, patiently, and that he would keep loving me whether I was ready to say it back or not. I cried, of course, but they were different tears than the ones I had cried in the months after the wedding. These felt like relief, like the slow exhale after holding your breath for far too long. I told him I loved him too, and I meant it with a certainty that surprised me, not because I doubted my feelings but because I had genuinely wondered if I would ever feel that safe again. Our relationship grew slowly and deliberately over the following year, built not on grand romantic gestures but on the steady accumulation of trust, the kind that gets rebuilt one honest conversation at a time. I told Julian everything about the wedding eventually, every humiliating and painful detail, and he listened without judgment, occasionally reaching for my hand but never interrupting, letting me tell the story at my own pace and in my own words. When I finished, he told me something that has stayed with me ever since. He said that Thomas hadn't left me for Vivian because I wasn't enough, he had left because he had never actually finished a story that started long before I entered his life, and that some people carry unfinished chapters with them until they're forced to face them, sometimes at the worst possible moments. He said it wasn't my job to have been perfect enough to prevent that, and that the fact I had walked away with my dignity intact, setting down that ring instead of begging him to stay, said more about my character than anything that had happened before it. I want to pause here and acknowledge something important, because I think it matters for anyone listening who has been on the other side of heartbreak like mine. I did eventually hear, through mutual friends, what happened to Thomas and Vivian. Their reunion, it turned out, was not the fairy tale he had abandoned me for. Vivian, still raw from her own divorce, was not in a place to build something stable with anyone, and Thomas, having burned so many bridges to be with her, including the trust of nearly everyone who had once respected him, found himself facing a version of loneliness he hadn't anticipated. They stayed together for a little over a year before Vivian moved abroad again, this time for good, leaving Thomas to reckon with the wreckage of choices he had made in a single reckless moment at my wedding. I heard he wrote me a letter once, though I never opened it. Delphine offered to read it and summarize it for me if I wanted, but I told her I didn't need to hear anything else from him. I had already given him more of my life than he deserved, and I wasn't interested in giving him one more piece of my peace. I share this not out of bitterness, though I won't pretend there isn't some complicated satisfaction in knowing his choice didn't bring him the happiness he sacrificed everything for. I share it because I think it's important to understand that walking away from someone who hurts you, even when it feels like the end of the world, is rarely actually the end. Sometimes it's the very beginning of a story you couldn't have written for yourself while you were still standing in someone else's shadow. Julian proposed to me 2 years after we met, on a spring morning, in the most unassuming way imaginable, which somehow made it more perfect than any grand gesture could have. We were in the kitchen of the small cottage we had recently bought together, making breakfast, Baxter underfoot begging for scraps as he always did, and Julian simply set down the spatula he was holding, turned to me with flour on his hands and a slightly nervous look on his face, and asked if I would marry him. There was no elaborate speech, no orchestrated surprise, just Julian, honest and steady, asking the question in the middle of an ordinary morning because he said he didn't want to wait for a perfect moment, he wanted to start our life together in the imperfect, beautiful ordinariness of every single day. I said yes before he even finished the question, laughing and crying at the same time, and Baxter barked as if he understood exactly what was happening and fully approved. Planning our wedding felt entirely different from the first time. I found myself less concerned with perfection and more focused on meaning. We chose a small gathering, close family and true friends only, held in the garden behind our cottage rather than any grand venue, because Julian and I had both come to value intimacy over spectacle. My mother, who had been so protective and heartbroken on my behalf after the first wedding, cried happy tears throughout the entire planning process, telling me repeatedly how proud she was of the woman I had become, not despite what happened to me, but because of how I had chosen to move through it. Charlotte served as my maid of honor again, and this time, when she helped me into my dress on the morning of the wedding, there was no anxious energy in the room, only quiet joy and the comfortable certainty that comes from finally, truly knowing you're making the right choice. Delphine, ever the protector, insisted on standing at the very back of the garden during the ceremony, only half joking that she was keeping watch for any uninvited guests who might try to interrupt things a second time. When I laughed and asked if she was serious, she simply said that after everything I had survived, she wasn't taking any chances, and that she loved me too much to let history repeat itself. I told her that this time, history had nothing to do with it, because Julian wasn't running from anything or toward anyone else. He was exactly where he wanted to be, and so was I. The ceremony itself was simple and unhurried, held beneath an old oak tree that had stood on the property long before we bought it, its branches offering dappled shade against the midday sun. I remember walking down a short grassy aisle toward Julian, who was crying openly before I even reached him, unashamed and unguarded in a way that Thomas, for all his charm, had never quite managed to be. When I reached him, he took both my hands in his and told me, in front of everyone gathered, that he didn't just love who I was, he loved who I had chosen to become after everything that had tried to break me, and that he considered himself the luckiest man alive to get to spend his life with someone who had proven, through the hardest possible circumstances, exactly what strength and grace looked like. I don't think there was a single dry eye among our guests by the time he finished speaking. We exchanged vows that felt earned rather than merely spoken, promises built not on the fantasy of a perfect life together but on the honest understanding that love requires effort, patience, and the daily choice to show up for one another even when things are difficult. When the officiant finally pronounced us married, Julian kissed me the way he had kissed me for 2 years, gently and completely, and I felt, for the first time since that terrible day in the barn, that I had finally arrived exactly where I was always meant to be, just later and through a much harder road than I had originally planned. If you've made it this far in the story, I want to ask you something important before we reach the end. Think about the moments in your own life when you had to let go of something painful in order to make room for something better. What lesson did that experience teach you about strength, forgiveness, or hope? I would love for you to share that in the comments below, because stories like these are made richer when our community shares its own wisdom and healing with one another. In the years since my second wedding, life has continued in the beautifully ordinary way that I once feared I would never get to experience. Julian and I welcomed a daughter, a bright and stubborn little girl we named Rosalind, who has her father's calm patience and, according to everyone who knows me, my own fierce determination. Watching Julian as a father has only deepened my love and respect for him, seeing the same steady, quiet devotion he showed me during our courtship now extended to our daughter, who adores him with the kind of uncomplicated love only children can give. My parents dote on Rosalind endlessly, and Charlotte, who has since had children of her own, jokes that our two families have essentially merged into one loud, loving unit that gathers for Sunday dinners and holidays with a warmth that fills every room we occupy. I think often about the woman I was on the morning of my first wedding, so certain that happiness meant getting every detail right, so afraid that any imperfection might unravel everything I had built. I wish I could go back and tell her that the unraveling, when it eventually came, would not be the end of her story but the painful, necessary beginning of a much truer one. I wish I could tell her that setting down that ring on the table beside the peonies was not an act of defeat but the first act of genuine self-respect she had shown in years, and that walking away from a life built on someone else's unfinished business would eventually lead her to a life built on solid, honest ground. I don't hate Thomas anymore, and I want to be honest about that, because I think forgiveness is one of the most important lessons this entire experience taught me. I don't excuse what he did. Leaving someone at the altar, in front of everyone who loves you, is a wound that never fully disappears, even after healing. But I have come to understand that his choice, as devastating as it was in the moment, ultimately freed me from a life that would have always had a locked door somewhere inside it, a room I was never quite allowed to enter, filled with a love story that wasn't mine. I have made peace with the fact that sometimes the most painful things that happen to us are actually redirections, painful detours away from a future that would have eventually hurt us far more slowly and quietly than one single devastating afternoon. I think about Vivian sometimes too, though rarely with the bitterness I once felt. I understand now that she wasn't a villain in my story, not really, just a woman carrying her own grief and confusion, who happened to walk through a door at the worst possible moment for me and, in some ways, for herself as well. None of us are the villains of our own stories, even when we cause pain to others. We are simply people, flawed and searching, sometimes making choices in moments of panic or longing that we don't fully understand until much later, if we understand them at all. What I know for certain, sitting here now with my daughter's laughter echoing from the next room and my husband's steady presence just down the hall, is that the version of happiness I eventually built was infinitely more solid than the version I nearly settled for. Real love, I have learned, isn't about grand gestures or picture-perfect weddings. It's about showing up, again and again, in the ordinary moments that make up a life, choosing someone not out of fear of being alone but out of genuine, steady devotion. It's about being with someone who doesn't just love the parts of you that are easy to love, but who stays through the parts that are difficult, uncertain, and still healing. If there is one thing I hope you take away from my story, it is this. If you have ever been left standing somewhere, humiliated or heartbroken, wondering how you will possibly move forward, please believe me when I tell you that it is possible not just to survive that moment but to build something far more beautiful on the other side of it. The setting down of that ring, the walking away from a life that no longer served me, was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it was also the bravest, and it opened a door to a life I could never have imagined for myself while I was still standing in the wreckage of the one I lost. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the lesson or emotion that resonated with you most, share it with someone in your life who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about kindness, forgiveness, and the quiet, powerful miracle of second chances. Our community exists because people like you believe that broken hearts deserve better endings, and every single time you engage with a story like this one, you help someone else out there feel a little less alone in their own healing. I used to think that the worst day of my life was the day Thomas walked away from our wedding and toward the woman he never truly let go of. Now, years later, surrounded by a family I chose deliberately and a love that never once asked me to shrink myself to fit inside it, I understand that day differently. It wasn't the worst day of my life. It was simply the day my real story finally began, painful and shocking and entirely unexpected, but ultimately, unmistakably, the first page of something far better than anything I could have written for myself. And if you are standing at your own version of that altar right now, wondering whether you have the strength to set down what no longer serves you, I promise you, with everything I have learned, that you do. You absolutely do. And on the other side of that courage, something beautiful is waiting, exactly the way it waited for me.